Welcome to The Explainer. The week of August 14th through the 20th, 2026, was actually incredibly fascinating. And that's because it wasn't defined by some massive stack of new executive orders or formal paperwork. Instead, the administration's highest consequence moves came entirely through intense implementation, rapid escalation, and heavy regulatory pressure. It's like a masterclass in applying coercive leverage, spanning foreign adversaries, our neighboring allies, domestic broadcasters, and the immigrant workforce. But the absolute most important part of our analysis today isn't just tracking what happened in Washington. We need to look at what these actions literally do in the real world, especially for regular Americans and the working class.
Okay, let's dive into this. We're going to systematically trace this out across 5 areas. 1. Economic warfare meets energy costs. 2. Tariff threats and supply chains. 3. Free speech and broadcast licenses. 4. Immigration actions hit healthcare labor. And 5. The $40 trillion reality.
Part 1. Economic warfare meets energy costs. Let's start over in the Middle East. This week, the administration noticeably shifted its posture away from a potential diplomatic off-ramp and steered heavily toward coercive economic escalation backed by military threats. To really get a handle on this shift, let's walk through the rapid sequence of verified actions. On August 17th, President Trump publicly rejected an extension of an interim arrangement with Iran, basically stating they wouldn't accept a necessary deal. He also threatened military action against Oman if it interfered with U.S. aims in the Strait of Hormuz. Literally the very next day, August 18th, he explicitly stated no talks with Tehran were even underway. By August 20th, Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent was publicly promising to impose the toughest sanctions in history, right on the heels of the president threatening economic warfare against any countries providing Iran a lifeline. Now here's where it gets really interesting. The disconnect between the geopolitical goals and our domestic reality. The stated goal on paper is maximum economic pressure. They want to force concessions from Iran without engaging in a ground war while protecting freedom of navigation. But the likely effect, the immediate ripple effect that hits the working class, it's energy inflation. When shipping through a massive choke point like the Strait of Hormuz is impaired, or honestly, even just perceived as unsafe, crude oil and freight risk premiums shoot up immediately. And those elevated costs, they don't just stay overseas. They propagate directly into the prices of gasoline, diesel fuel, food distribution, and manufactured goods right here at home. Moving on to Part 2, tariff threats and supply chains. Let's pivot from foreign economic warfare to trade leverage a bit closer to home, specifically the Canadian border. Back in July, the administration announced Section 338 tariffs. We're talking about a massive 50% duty on nearly $20 billion of Canadian goods tied to auto, alcohol, and dairy disputes. Now, those were scheduled to take effect this very week, but on August 18th, the administration suddenly paused implementation for a brief 3-day window. They essentially converted a near-certain punitive tariff into a short-term bargaining chip. And hey, it got things moving. By August 19th, negotiators were already at the table discussing materially lower auto and metals tariffs. And this brilliantly illustrates exactly how tariffs function in the real economy. Because while a credible tariff threat might pry open foreign markets, and imposing them might protect a few specific domestic producers, the financial burden definitely isn't confined to Canada. Look at Step 2. That's where the rubber meets the road. U.S. importers are the ones who initially pay that duty to our government. From there, manufacturer margins shrink, retail costs rise, and ultimately it acts as a supply chain tax. Boom, cost shock for the U.S. household. It's a high-stakes game of chicken, and the American consumer is sitting right in the passenger seat, heavily exposed to the risk. Part 3, free speech and broadcast licenses. Shifting gears to domestic regulatory pressure, this week saw a massive collision between the Federal Communications Commission and network broadcasters. This is right at the intersection of corporate interests, regulatory power, and the First Amendment. On August 18th, Disney, ABC, and 8 station licensees formally sued the FCC and its chair, Brendan Carr. They're challenging these unprecedented early broadcast license renewal proceedings. Now, it's absolutely crucial that we impartially separate verified facts from legal allegations here. It is a certified fact that the lawsuit exists and the FCC's early license review process is actively happening. Reuters also reported ABC's claim that this regulatory pressure has already forced them to alter programming choices. However, the allegation that this constitutes unconstitutional First Amendment retaliation, that is just that, an allegation. As of August 20th, a judge actually declined an accelerated hearing, meaning the courts have not yet ruled on the merits of these claims. But looking at this contrast really highlights just how high the civil liberties stakes are for the public. Sure, the direct pocketbook effect of this lawsuit on a regular household might be zero,
But the institutional cost could be massive. Routine enforcement of public interest rules, perfectly lawful. But if broadcasters begin to reasonably believe their operating licenses can be targeted simply because the administration dislikes their editorial choices, we enter the realm of protected speech retaliation. The ultimate consequence of that chilling effect is less adversarial reporting, fewer viewpoints on television, and a severe reduction in democratic accountability.
Part 4. Immigration actions hit healthcare labor. Moving over to domestic labor, the administration's immigration policy is visibly colliding with the courts and, critically, with sectors of the economy heavily dependent on immigrant labor. We actually saw really mixed results in federal courts this week. On August 18th, the Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals left in place a narrow, preliminary injunction protecting 8 specific houses of worship from certain Department of Homeland Security enforcement actions, citing a substantial threat to religious exercise. But, on that exact same day, a federal judge in Massachusetts allowed the administration's termination of temporary protected status, or TPS, for over 5,000 Ethiopians to move forward following recent Supreme Court precedent. But honestly, the real story here isn't just the legal battle over who gets to stay. It's the labor market shock when people are forced to leave. The administration's stated goal is ensuring that temporary status remains genuinely temporary, actively reducing the number of people with work authorization. But we're now seeing the observable, real-world effects of a previous administrative action, the termination of Haitian TPS. Think about it. When you remove work authorizations, you aren't just changing a legal status on a piece of paper. You're pulling workers out of the economy. And the immediate effect is severe labor shortages in critical, already labor-scarce sectors, like elder care, group homes, and home health care. To really grasp the magnitude, look at this number, 21,000. According to an August 19th report by Reuters, there are roughly 21,000 Haitian TPS holders working specifically in caregiver roles in the United States right now. These folks are firmly embedded in the U.S. care infrastructure. As their work authorizations evaporate, employers are legally forced to lay them off, leaving massive vacancies in an industry that is already desperately struggling to find reliable staff. So the crucial point is this next number right here, 77,000. That is the estimated number of disabled and elderly U.S. patients directly connected to that specific workforce. These are American citizens who have nothing to do with the immigration system, yet they are the ones bearing the second-order costs. They're facing disrupted relationships with their caregivers, a total loss of continuity in their daily medical and personal care, and potentially much higher costs as facilities struggle with overtime and staffing shortages. It highlights a profound tension. You can absolutely support strict immigration enforcement, but the economic reality is that removing these workers directly degrades the care network that tens of thousands of vulnerable Americans rely on every single day. Part 5. The $40 trillion reality. Finally, let's zoom out to the broader macroeconomic backdrop that complicates literally everything we've discussed today. On August 19th, the United States federal debt officially crossed the $40 trillion threshold. Now, to be absolutely clear, this was not a discrete action taken by the Trump administration this week. This monumental, frankly staggering figure is the result of compounding deficits spanning multiple administrations, Republican and Democratic, over many, many years. But it absolutely matters right now. It matters because this debt level creates a materially worse interest cost backdrop for the entire country. It means the federal government has a sharply reduced margin for error. Every single current choice regarding tax policy, government spending, tariff implementation, or military escalation is heavily constrained by the cost of servicing that debt. And when debt service starts eating up the budget, the secondary costs of things like supply chain shocks or energy inflation are ultimately felt even more acutely by everyday working-class families who already lack economic security. When you look at this week's reliance on pressure without paperwork, from threatening to bomb Oman and risking energy inflation, to leveraging tariffs that could act as a massive supply chain tax, to regulatory actions that might chill free speech, and immigration policies that are objectively fracturing domestic healthcare labor, the ultimate accountability metric becomes very clear. The true test of this immense coercive leverage is whether it actually produces durable, long-term gains for the country that manage to outweigh the highly visible, everyday costs it is creating for American households right now.